The views and opinions expressed on the Nova Society are those of the panelists and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Phoenix Research Institute or any institution which any panel member is associated. Reproduction or dissemination other than for the purpose of education or information without the express written permission of the Phoenix Research Institute or Nova Society Media is strictly prohibited.
I'd like to welcome everyone back to the Nova Society. I'm your host, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and I'm here with my panel, Dr. Scott Gershwer and Dr. Mark Pound. Today, our panel will once again be answering questions from our listeners. Welcome, everyone. We are delighted to have you back. Today, we answer a question from Rebecca from Birmingham in Alabama. Rebecca asks, I'm hearing a new term, storm politics. So I wanted some details of what the panel thinks about this area of politics. How would you define storm politics? How much influence do you think storm politics has on elections? What might be the impact of the two hurricanes this October have on elections?
Scott's looking at me for this one.
I want you to start.
Yeah, you want me to start? The term storm politics, and I kind of looked it up. You're right, Rebecca. And first of all, let me say, being from Birmingham, Alabama, I'm very sorry about Alabama's loss to Vanderbilt this past weekend. Anyway, it's a new term. Storm politics to me is on the same vein. If you've got a natural disaster that is handled well by the administration in power at the time, it can work for them. Now, you know, one of the things that we recorded earlier today was about the concept of the United States being able to control the weather. If you believe that, then maybe that is a different aspect to storm politics. Oh, they're out to get me. They're trying to stop my vote. They're only punishing red states. And it's those damn Democrats that are in power that is controlling the weather and creating all this havoc in places like Florida and with the two hurricanes and stuff, which is, first of all, ridiculous. It's just totally ridiculous. But if an administration handles the disaster well, it bodes, of course, well for them. But if they don't, then again, it'll work against them. But that's the same idea as with any kind of social issue or national crisis or something like that. And a great example is after 9/11, George Bush's popularity went off the roof. He became, at one point in time, he was like he was almost more popular than George Washington because of, his address and because the country rallies behind. And I think storm politics is the same kind of idea. If you do well with a natural disaster, which I think they are doing as well as they can be, especially with the second hurricane about to hit, as we're recording this tomorrow, in an area that's already been devastated not more than 2 weeks ago. I think that you're going to give out the kudos. So I think you're going to hear a lot of stuff come out that is going to be misinformation and disinformation to make you believe that the government is not doing the right thing or is not providing the support necessary. And I think that goes into storm politics. And one great example is even Ron DeSantis had said, we're getting everything we need. The governor of Georgia, a Republican, we're getting everything we need. All these governors of all these states, and there's a lot of national politicians who are saying, no, FEMA isn't there. There's no money. There's this, the money's going toward this, money's going toward that, and all these other silly things that they're doing. And the fact is that again, not true. And so they're trying to make the reaction to these disasters, which are as effective as you can get. I mean, let's face it, Mother Nature, I remember the old thing, don't fool with Mother Nature. Well, Mother Nature hits you and kicks your ass. It takes you time to be able to get in there and do all the things. I live no more than probably 40 minutes from Asheville, North Carolina. We were hit. We were without power. We got hit pretty good here in the upstate of South Carolina, but nothing compared to what happened in the counties not more than 20 miles away from me, because I'm about 15 miles from the border of North Carolina. We're heading toward Asheville. And just having friends up there, there's only so much you can do in such a little time. So I think it's people playing politics, and I think that's what really storm politics is. People playing politics, misinformation and disinformation. But I think they're doing the best they can.
Yeah. So, you're looking at two candidates who really could not be less alike, right? I mean, this is the most stark contrast we've ever seen in a political race. A woman of color, a woman, who's Asian, Jamaican, who has risen through the ranks of politics from her humble beginning as a prosecutor, running for DA, becoming the state attorney general, U.S. senator, vice president, and now running for president. And God willing, will be the next president of the United States. Compared to a guy who inherited $400 million, spent some of that money to get into politics by criticizing Ronald Reagan, by suggesting, in his foreign policy, right? The headline on an ad, nobody would run it as an op-ed, so he took out ads that in a bunch of big newspapers, including the Times and the Wall Street Journal, that said, there's nothing wrong with American foreign policy that a little backbone couldn't fix. And that was a rip on Ronald Reagan for making an arms deal with the Soviet Union. Whether you believe it or not, possibly has been a Soviet asset or a Russian asset for many, many years, whether he actually believes it or understands it or not. And the information that we've just gotten yesterday from Bob Woodward, that he's had these conversations with Vladimir Putin, that he didn't go through the proper channels to let the current administration know that he was going to be talking to Vladimir Putin. In fact, kicked one of his own aides out of the room so he could have a private conversation with Vladimir Putin, that he's just a very different candidate than anybody we've ever seen before. And of course, we know that he worships these autocrats, right? His favorite people in the world his role models seem to be dictators, and he wants to be a dictator. He says on day one or for day one or for one day, it doesn't matter what he says when it comes to this kind of thing, because he's kind of giving a little hint. And some people are going to hear it and other people are going to hear something completely different. But what it does say is that he uses storms as leverage. That's his background. He uses storms as leverage. There was a hurricane that rumbled through up the East Coast in October of 2016. 6 months later, North Carolina was still digging out from that storm. 6 months later. And the governor, Roy Cooper, asked the federal government for more assistance so that they could rebuild churches and roads and schools and things that had been devastated by the storm. And Trump turned him down because he needed that money to build his wall, and he had already robbed FEMA of a great deal of their money. So he says, and I think he has openly admitted this, that he prefers people who are loyal to him and is more willing to give assets that are needed to red state governors who kiss his ass or states that had voted for him. It's a continual piece that he looks at a storm as a great opportunity to reinforce his will over his subjects. So that's one part of, this politics. And the other stuff, I mean, just as a little aside here, if you don't mind, the other stuff that one of the other items that Woodward put in his book was that during the height of the COVID pandemic, that Trump sent two very elaborate test machines to Vladimir Putin at the same exact time that he was telling governors, hey, the federal government is not a delivery service for you. So, he was very much playing governors that are loyal to him off of governors who weren't. And even Larry Hogan, the governor of Maryland, who's a Republican but in a blue state, had to go to South Korea to friends of his wife's family to get supplies that he needed for the people of Maryland because Trump was willing to withhold them. So the storm itself, he looks at Helene and he looks at Milton and he sees a juicy opportunity to put his foot on the face or the throat of people that he doesn't like and to reward people that he does like. And that's all he can say about it. And when Kamala Harris was asked yesterday in one of the many interviews that she's done recently about how she's going to get the money for her economic plan, she said, well, we're going to raise taxes on the rich and make sure that they pay their fair share. Trump was asked about that last night, on one of the crazy networks that exist now. I forget which one it was. And he says, you don't tax the rich. You just don't do that. So Kamala Harris is being idiotic because you just don't tax the rich, and that you tax, regular people. And that's what they're there for. It's the many who are giving up to the few who are on top. An elitist position from somebody who's trying to appeal to people who call East Coast elites and people who have college degrees elites and so on and so forth. But this is the most elite human being ever in U.S. politics. The other part of storm politics that I think is really important is that there was some analysis, and I read this in the New York Times, by a group called the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. It's a nonprofit, and it looks at online platforms. And it looked at 33 posts that had contained disinformation about the flood response, right? And they had generated, those 33 post had generated 160 million views as of Monday. And the posts drove a lot of these false claims that have been going on, that people aren't getting what they need because they're hillbillies or red state whatevers, and that the federal government is dissing them. And a large number of those attacks were anti-Semitic. So, for example, the mayor of Asheville, North Carolina, Esther Manheimer, Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, FEMA's Director of Public Affairs, Jacqueline Rothenberg, they all have Jewish heritage. And they are all getting called out as being Jews who are not supportive of, quote unquote, real Americans. And it is just painful. It is not obviously helpful. It is disgraceful, and it continues to reverberate through the electorate. So I'm sorry for the length of this diatribe, but there are going to be ramifications for this storm. I think the GOP remembers the hug that Chris Christie gave Obama, which really did have an effect on the 2012 race. And it really did send the message that Republicans always want to cut funds for things that we absolutely have to have, and Democrats are always protecting them, and that in a time of crisis like this, you're much better off with Democrats in the White House and in Congress than you are with Republicans, because they're not going to be voting to cut these funds that you so desperately need, but that you forget about, frankly, when you don't need them. But when you need them, you need them. They have no compunction at all, these Republicans, of going, how come there's no money, when they voted against the money? So it's a very, very stark contrast between the two candidates who are running, between the two parties that control this country or want to control this country, and that there is such a thing as truth, folks. Go with the truth. There is such a thing as character. Go with the character. Don't worry so much about the policies. That gets ironed out. But you have to go with people of character, and Trump has none.
And also, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, he has not and does not intend to have Congress return, the House return to session to provide any more money for FEMA until after the election, in which case then I guess the idea is that people are going to be angry at the Biden administration. I heard that today. Is that the case, to your knowledge?
I think that's what they're hoping for. Even moderate Republicans are pushing back against that. So even on Fox News, which sometimes in the face of the insanity of those other networks, what are they? Newsmax, and what's the other one?
OAN. OAN.
Okay, right. Who are the even crazier than Fox is? Fox got the memo or a fact sheet that the House Appropriations Committee had put together, a Republican-led committee that debunked a lot of these claims made by Trump and his supporters. Said that FEMA has the money, they're not giving it to immigrants. They have billions of dollars that are going to be used in the rescue of people who really need it, and so on and so forth. And that's Tom Cole from Oklahoma is one of those sort of moderate Republicans, a sensible guy who wants to push back against this insanity.
And may I say that just another reason for Mike Johnson, as Scott would say, to have the most punchable face in America. The Rebecca's question about what is storm politics, it really comes down to how you take people's suffering and use it. And that's why I say this is something that isn't really new. It's just because of the storms. It's like right in our face today. And yeah, they're good. I would say, just to make it very clear, there are some very sensible, moderate Republicans, and they are necessary. And a more gracious God would let them take over the Republican Party. Unfortunately, it just does not seem to be happening. Who understand that people suffering is not a way to make political hay. Those people that support Trump are going to believe this right down the line. That's just kind of the way it's going to go. You're not going to change their minds because they're in the cult. But hopefully more people will look at this and say, hey, why isn't Mike Johnson calling back our United States Congress to be able to help these people? And the funny thing is it's not only the people in North Carolina, it's not only the people in Florida, it's not only the people in Georgia and other places that have been impacted by this, South Carolina included. It's also the people from like the West Coast that feel, that have empathy for, their fellow citizens that are suffering through this. How many, they have their own natural disasters too. California, the ground shakes, earthquakes, things like that. In the plains, you've got tornadoes. You've got, the devastation that can come from tornadoes. So they can feel the pain that those here in the Southeast are going through, because even though they may not have had a hurricane hit them, they have had to deal with natural disasters in communities, and they can feel the empathy. And when you look and you say the United States Congress will not be called back to be able to deal with this situation in a timely manner, no, you in North Carolina, you've got to wait till after the election. Oh, and by the way, if we're elected out, we're a lame duck Congress. How much do you think we're going to do as a lame duck Congress? It's insanity. It's insanity to follow through, to follow these people because they're not helping anyone but themselves. And again, they're trying to tell you it's somebody else's fault. Well, I got news for you. The hurricane is nobody's fault, no matter what Marjorie Taylor Greene says about controlling the weather. It is not somebody's fault. This is an act of nature. And this is a time when we all come together, and we do need. You can be as libertarian as you want. You can be as Tea Party as you want. This is the time that when we need the power of the federal government to assist the states the way it's supposed to be able to relieve the suffering of many of these people that they're going through. And everything I've seen about this Hurricane Milton coming through, this is a monster. Helena was bad. This is worse. Now, it's not going to affect as many states, as many people, but if you're in the Tampa area, this is going to have a huge impact in your lives. And to have the Speaker of the House of Representatives say, "No, I'm not going to call him back in the hopes, as Scott says, that you're going to blame the Democrats for this." I think it's First of all, I think it's the wrong move, number one. It's the inhumane move, number two. And I think it's a stupid move because the only people that are going to buy into it are the people dumb enough to have already bought into the rest of the bullshit that you put out there previously.
And the other point also that they're making in Project 2025 is to remove FEMA from the federal government purview and make it state and local funds that are going to pay for disasters. And there's no way that state and local funding is going to pay for disasters and catastrophes of this magnitude. It's simply not going to happen.
Well, and on top of it, 2025 would get rid of NOAA.
Right.
NOAA would go away. So guess what? You wouldn't even know this stuff was coming until it was on your back door. How many lives would be lost in Florida starting tomorrow? How many lives would be lost if NOAA wasn't there warning them and telling them, you got to get the hell out? Can you imagine Florida getting blindsided by this?
Yes, and the National Weather Service would be gone along with the National Hydrological Service, which checks the height of rivers that are flood prone. That would also be gone. So anybody who lives on a river floodplain, who relies on people who check the water rates, the height rate of the river, that would never, you'd never know if the river was going to crest or not. All that would be gone, as well as the funds would have to be coming from your local state and your local town or county. And this is going to, I guess, help to balance the budget or get rid of the deficit or help to enrich wealthy people further. It's untenable. And as you say, with NOAA gone, no one's going to know when the storm is coming anyway. Although they would privatize these services, so I guess if you wanted them, you'd have to pay for them.
The craziest thing about this is that there's this wish on the part of Republicans that this would be Biden's Katrina, and I don't think that's going to happen. But it's weird that they would even want it to happen. I mean, Katrina was a huge storm that caused $125 billion in damage. It displaced 1 million people, right? So, I mean, it was like the Trail of Tears times plenty, moving people from one part of the country where they had homes to dispersing them out. It was the largest diaspora in U.S. history, Katrina. And Bush's response to it was horrific. Now, it was followed a couple of months later in October of 2005 by Wilma, which was the strongest hurricane, caused $26 billion, 52 deaths, a little bit less destructive than Katrina was, but enormously damaging. And at that time, I was working for a company that did mailings, put together mailings for other companies, and it's what they call a hot site. When disasters like this hit, back in the day when they used to have to send out mail to get paid, like bills, so like Sprint or American Express would put out a mail piece with a bill in it to people, right? They never wanted that to be interrupted because that's how they get the money that runs their companies. So they relied on this hot site that my company was running to be the backup for their normal business, right? And what ended up happening was a storm in North Carolina, which is where Bank of America, I think it was, or American Express, I can't recall, had their billing operation. The lights were out, they couldn't do it, so they wanted to kick into the hot site. FEMA had declared eminent domain and taken over the hot site because they had run out of money to send packets to people who were affected by all these storms, right? 2005, I think there were 5 major hurricanes that year. And they had just run out of money. One of the reasons they ran out of money was because 2004 was an election year, And every time it drizzled in Ohio and Michigan, Bush was declaring a disaster area and funneling federal money into those two states, which he needed to win the 2004 election. So he had tapped into FEMA's funds even for the following year. And in the summer and fall of 2005, there was a big budget shortfall because of that. That's, again, Republican politics. It's kind of standard politics. And I really think that people, when they cast votes, need to look at these things and factor them in. Is it the biggest thing? Probably not. Is it bigger than abortion? Maybe not. I mean, there are a lot of issues, obviously. But again, you see it time and time and time again, the politics of storms and how negatively it reflects, I think, on the Republican Party, who really is more about, fiscal conservatism, whatever that means to you, and is, let's just say, slightly corrupt. I mean, again, I brought up before Hurricane Matthew. 6 months later, Roy Cooper couldn't get the money he needed to rebuild North Carolina because Trump had stolen that money from FEMA and was using it to build the wall. Stuff like that. You gotta factor that into your thinking when you cast a vote. That's why Sandy and Chris Christie hugging Obama was such a big deal. That's why Chris Christie, is now hated by everybody on both parties and everybody else who has ever met him, probably. And that's why you really need to vote carefully and understand what's at stake in these elections.
Thank you both. And thank you to our listener for the question. We appreciate it. And we will see you next time.
So that's all the time we have for today's episode. The Nova Society is a production of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our sponsors for this episode. BH Conflict Resolution Services, a full-service dispute resolution firm offering expert and cost-effective mediation services to couples, groups, and businesses. BHCRS can be reached at www.bhcrs.com. We'd also like to thank our podcast partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, our editing partners, and Podkite, who does all of our analytics. iHeartRadio, where people get their music and podcasts, Apple iTunes, the largest source for music and podcasts on the internet, Spotify, the most popular source for the Nova Society. The Nova Society is available on all of these and other quality platforms. We'd like to thank all of our listeners. Without you, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a comment, question, or would like to be a guest on the Nova Society, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. Always remember, the power of society is knowledge. So for Dr. Scott Gershwer, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Be well, and we hope to see you again next time.